The clinking of crystal wine glasses and the low, sultry jazz of Anton's Steakhouse masked the sound of the approaching storm. Christopher was lost in Chloe's eyes, laughing at a joke he wouldn't remember tomorrow, his hand resting intimately over hers on the crisp white tablecloth. Life felt flawlessly engineered. He had the lucrative vice president title, the intoxicating mistress, and a compliant wife safely tucked away in the quiet suburbs. But as the maitre d' approached, not with their dessert, but with a thick, legally sealed envelope, the laughter died in Christopher's throat. It was an expedited divorce notice, and his wife wasn't just leaving him, she was pregnant. Anton's was the kind of restaurant where the waitstaff didn't walk, they glided, dimly lit by flickering candlelight and accented by dark mahogany walls. It was a sanctuary for the city's elite and for men like Christopher Reynolds, who needed shadows to hide their indiscretions. It was a Tuesday night, 8:15 p.m. Across the table sat Chloe Montgomery. She was a striking woman, a junior art director at Chris's advertising firm with sharp features, an explosive laugh, and an ambition that mirrored his own. They were celebrating his recent bonus, a massive six-figure payout that he had told his wife, Sarah, was delayed until next quarter due to corporate restructuring. "I'm just saying, Chris," Chloe purred, tracing the rim of her Merlot glass with a manicured fingernail. "If you keep letting the board dictate your weekend hours, we're never going to make it to Napa this fall, and I need Napa." Christopher chuckled, a deep, easy sound. He squeezed her hand. "Don't worry about the board. I have them eating out of my palm, and as for Napa, consider it booked. I'll just tell Sarah I have a summit in Chicago." Chloe's smile widened, her eyes flashing with that thrilling mix of adoration and greed that made Chris feel invincible. She opened her mouth to reply, a flirtatious remark dying on her lips as a shadow fell over their table. It was the maître d', a stoic man named Henri, who usually guarded the privacy of his VIP guests with his life. Henri looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Mr. Reynolds," Henri said, his voice a low, discreet hum. "My apologies for the interruption. A courier just arrived. He insisted this be delivered to you immediately. He claimed it was a matter of urgent legal significance." Henri extended a silver tray. Resting on it was a thick, heavy envelope. It wasn't standard mail. It bore the embossed seal of Sterling and Hayes, one of the most ruthless family law firms in the state. Chris frowned, his perfect evening suddenly cracking at the edges. Legal significance? At 8:30 at night? Who sends a courier to a restaurant? "I'm sorry, sir. He had your exact reservation details." Chloe leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Open it, Chris. Maybe it's from the firm? Did something happen with the Miller account?" Chris picked up the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy. He tore the top with his thumb, reaching inside to pull out a stack of impeccably printed documents. The bold, black letters at the top of the first page seemed to swim in the dim candlelight. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Petitioner, Sarah Ann Reynolds. Respondent, Christopher David Reynolds. A cold, icy dread pooled in his stomach. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the jazz, the clinking glasses, Chloe's voice asking him what it was, faded into a muffled buzz. "Chris?" Chloe prompted, her tone sharpening. "You're pale. What is it?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He flipped frantically to the second page, skipping the legal jargon to find the personal declarations. Sarah had cited irreconcilable differences, fueled by documented infidelity. Documented. He felt a drop of sweat trail down his spine. He and Chloe had been so careful. Separate hotels, burner phones, cash payments for dinners like this one. How could Sarah know? Sarah, who baked sourdough on Sundays. Sarah, who thought Chris was the most stressed, hard-working man in the world. Sarah, who never asked questions. It's a divorce notice," Chris finally choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe's expression shifted instantly. The soft, adoring mistress vanished, replaced by a calculating pragmatist. "Sarah filed? How? Did she find out about us?" Before Chris could process her reaction, another piece of paper slipped from the stack and landed on the white tablecloth. It was a smaller, glossy square, a photograph. Chris picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a black and white sonogram. In the corner, printed in stark digital text, was the date 3 weeks ago. Clipped to the photograph was a small, handwritten note on Sarah's personalized stationery. I heard Anton's doze a lovely dry-aged ribeye. Enjoy it, Christopher. It's the last meal you'll be having on my dime. Your things are on the porch. Sarah. The drive from downtown to the affluent, tree-lined suburb of Oak Creek usually took 40 minutes. Christopher made it in 22, his Audi tearing through the slick, rain-soaked streets. His mind was a hurricane, pregnant. They had been trying for 2 years before the spark had died in their marriage. 2 years of timed intimacy, doctor's visits, and crushing disappointment. Eventually, Chris had stopped trying, finding his solace in Chloe's uncomplicated affection. Now, Sarah was pregnant, and she was leaving him. He pulled into the winding driveway of their sprawling colonial home. The house was entirely dark, save for the motion sensor security light that clicked on as his tires crunched against the gravel. True to her note, there were 3 large, black garbage bags sitting on the covered front porch. Chris threw his car into park and sprinted to the door, the cold rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He kicked one of the bags. It felt like clothes, his expensive, custom-tailored suits haphazardly shoved into hefty bags. He fumbled with his keys, hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice. When he finally forced the key into the deadbolt, it didn't turn. She changed the locks. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized his throat. He pounded his fist against the heavy oak door. Sarah! Sarah! Open the door! Let's talk about this. Please! Silence. He ran to the keypad for the garage door, punching in his 6-digit code. Beep, 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 error. She had wiped the security system. Desperation driving him, Chris rushed around to the back of the house, slipping on the wet grass. He remembered the faulty latch on the guest bedroom window that he had been meaning to fix for 6 months. He shimmied up the trellis, scraped his knuckles on the brick, and forced the window up. He tumbled into the darkness of the guest room, breathing heavily, smelling the familiar scent of lavender and cedarwood. Sarah? He called out, his voice echoing in the darkness. He flicked on the light switch. The room was empty, but it wasn't just empty of Sarah, it was stripped. Chris ran out into the hallway and practically fell down the sweeping mahogany staircase. He hit the lights in the living room. The Persian rug was gone. The antique armoire Sarah's grandmother had given them was gone. He sprinted to the kitchen. Her espresso machine, her collection of copper pots, the framed photos that used to line the mantel all vanished. It looked like a model home that had been staged and then abandoned. He walked into their master bedroom. His side of the closet was untouched, but her side was a cavernous void. No dresses, no shoes, no scent of her vanilla perfume lingering in the air. On the center island of her closet rested a single object. Her wedding ring, a 3-carat princess-cut diamond he had spent 6 months of his salary on, catching the harsh overhead light. Beside it lay a thick file folder. Chris opened it slowly, his dread returning. Inside were bank statements, joint accounts, savings, their shared investment portfolios. Every single one had been legally divided, her half wired out just hours before the courier arrived at Anton's. But there was something else. There were printouts of text messages, dozens of them. Conversations between him and Chloe. Can't wait for tonight. Told the wife I'm in Chicago. You're so much better than her. Chris dropped the folder, as if it were on fire. The walls of the massive, empty house felt like they were closing in on him. He slumped against the closet island, burying his face in his hands. He was alone. Utterly, completely alone. Chris woke up the next morning on the hardwood floor of the living room, his neck stiff and his head pounding with a vicious migraine. For a split second, he thought it was a nightmare. Then he saw the garbage bags of his clothes sitting outside the glass patio doors, soaked from the morning dew. His phone buzzed violently in his pocket. It was Chloe. Chris, where did you go last night? She demanded, her voice sharp. You left me sitting at Anton's with a $400 bill. I had to use my own card. Chloe, not now, Chris rasped, rubbing his temples. Sarah emptied the house. She's gone. She took half the money. There was a pause on the line. Half? What do you mean half? Chris, we were supposed to put a down payment on that condo in the city next month. You said that money was secure. The callousness in her voice grated on his already frayed nerves. My wife is pregnant, Chloe, and she just served me divorce papers. Forgive me if the condo isn't my top priority today. Don't snap at me, Christopher, she fired back, her tone turning icy. I'm not the one who got sloppy and let my wife find out. You need to call your lawyer and fix this. I'll see you at the office. She hung up. Chris stared at the phone. He didn't have time to dwell on Chloe's lack of empathy. He immediately dialed his lawyer and longtime college friend, David. David, it's Chris. I need you. Sarah served me last night. David let out a heavy sigh on the other end. I know, Chris. I got the courtesy copy of the filing from Sterling and Hayes this morning. Chris, what the hell did you do? I don't know how she found out. Chris paced the empty living room. She has texts. David, text messages. How is that even legal? And she drained the accounts. She took exactly 50%. Chris, which is her legal right in this state prior to an injunction, David explained, his voice sounding entirely too calm for the apocalypse Chris was experiencing. And about those texts, you need to come into my office. Now, there's something in this file you haven't seen yet. What is it? Just tell me. Sterling and Hayes didn't just file for divorce, Chris. They filed a notification with your company's board of directors this morning. They are invoking the morality clause in your executive contract. Chris stopped dead in his tracks. What? Sarah wouldn't do that. She knows my income is what supports us both. Chris, listen to me carefully, David said, his tone dropping an octave. Who do you think owns the majority voting shares of the firm you work for? Who facilitated your promotion to VP? Chris felt the blood drain from his face. Sarah's father. Exactly. Arthur Pendleton owns 40% of the firm. You didn't just cheat on your wife, Chris. You cheated on the boss's daughter. Arthur called an emergency board meeting for 10 a.m. They're going to terminate you, Chris. With cause. You lose the severance, the unvested stock options, everything. Chris dropped the phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor. He looked around the empty, cavernous house. He had thought he was the architect of his perfect, dual life. But as the morning sun illuminated, the dust motes dancing in the empty room, Christopher Reynolds finally realized the terrifying truth. He had never been the architect. He had been the pawn. And Sarah had just cleared the board. The drive to the downtown headquarters of Pendleton and Hayes Advertising felt like a march to the executioner's block. Christopher bypassed his usual premium parking spot. His keycard beeped red, a harsh, electronic rejection that confirmed David's warnings. He had to park 3 blocks away in a public garage, walking through the pouring rain in a wrinkled suit he'd pulled from the garbage bags on his porch. When the elevator doors dinged open on the executive floor, the silence was deafening. Usually, this floor hummed with the aggressive energy of million-dollar pitches and ringing phones. Today, secretaries averted their eyes. Junior executives suddenly found their shoes fascinating. Christopher marched straight toward the main boardroom. He didn't bother knocking. Sitting at the head of the long, polished oak table was Arthur Pendleton. Sarah's father was a man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice. He wore a bespoke navy suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his hands folded neatly over a leather-bound folio. To his left sat the head of HR, to his right, the firm's lead corporate counsel, and sitting at the far end of the table, looking pale and defensive, was Chloe. Christopher, Arthur said, his voice as smooth and cold as marble. Take a seat. Arthur, this is a personal matter, Chris started, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Whatever is happening between Sarah and me shouldn't impact my position here. I just closed the Miller account. I brought in 20% of this quarter's revenue. Sit down, Arthur commanded. Chris sank into one of the plush leather chairs. He glanced at Chloe, hoping for a sign of solidarity, but she refused to meet his gaze. She was staring a hole into the table, her jaw tightly clenched. Arthur opened the folio. This firm operates on trust, Christopher. Trust with our clients and trust within our ranks. You signed a renegotiated executive contract 3 months ago, which included a strict morality clause, a clause specifically designed to protect the reputation of this agency from public scandal. There is no public scandal, Chris argued, desperation leaking into his tone. It's a private divorce. It became a company liability the moment you engaged in a subordinate relationship on company time, using company resources. The HR director interjected, sliding a thick stack of papers across the table. Chris looked down. They were expense reports. His expense reports. The client dinners at Anton's. Arthur read from a sheet, adjusting his reading glasses. The business trips to Chicago that were actually weekend retreats at the Four Seasons in Aspen. You used the corporate card to fund your infidelity, Christopher. That is embezzlement. It is fraud. And it is grounds for immediate, uncompensated termination. Chris felt his lungs constrict. He looked frantically at Chloe. Chloe, tell them those were legitimate business expenses. We talked about the Miller account in Aspen. Chloe finally looked up, and the icy self-preservation in her eyes chilled Chris to the bone. I was coerced, Chloe said, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. Christopher is my direct superior. He implied that if I didn't accompany him on those trips, my promotion to senior art director would be compromised. I felt I had no choice. Coerced. The word hit Chris like a physical blow. He stared at her, utterly bewildered. Are you insane? You picked out the hotel in Aspen. You bought a $1,000 ski jacket on my card. Enough, Arthur snapped, closing his folio with a sharp thud. Miss Montgomery has agreed to cooperate fully with our internal audit in exchange for keeping her position. You, however, are done. The corporate counsel leaned forward. Christopher, you are officially terminated for cause. Your unvested stock options are revoked. Your severance package is voided. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal effects. You have 15 minutes. Chris sat frozen. The empire he had built over the last decade, the power, the money, the prestige, all of it had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes. As he stood up on shaking legs, Arthur looked at him one last time. There was no anger in the older man's eyes, only a profound, crushing pity. Sarah deserved a partner, Christopher. All you were was a parasite. Get out of my building. A week later, Christopher Reynolds was living out of room 114 at the Starlight Motor Inn, a generic, beige stucco extended stay motel situated precariously close to the deafening roar of Interstate 90. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar Oak Creek estate was currently under a strict, court-ordered lock and key, heavily guarded by private security pending the final divorce settlement. His bank accounts, every checking, savings, and joint investment portfolio were entirely frozen, placed under the aggressive magnification of Sarah's forensic accounting team. Yesterday, Chris had tried to buy a $3 black coffee at a corner bodega, only to have his platinum card harshly declined with a humiliating electronic beep. He sat on the edge of the motel's lumpy, sagging mattress, staring blindly at his laptop screen. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke, industrial bleach, and profound defeat. Outside, the flickering red neon of the motel's vacancy sign sliced through the cheap, plastic window blinds, casting jagged, bloody shadows across the peeling, floral wallpaper. Christopher's hands shook as he rubbed his bloodshot eyes. He needed to know how she did it. He needed to understand the exact mechanics of his own sudden, absolute destruction. Sarah was a baker of sourdough, a lover of antique fairs, a woman who wept during life insurance commercials. She was not a covert operative. How had she systematically dismantled a decade of his carefully constructed lies in a single evening? He had called in a massive, desperate favor from Simon, a freelance cybersecurity contractor and former college roommate who owed Chris a substantial debt from their fraternity days. Chris had handed over his personal laptop, a cloned drive of his phone data, and the login credentials to his car's GPS. begging Simon to find the leak. A harsh, rhythmic knock on the flimsy, hollow-core motel door jolted Chris from his spiraling thoughts. He practically leapt across the stained carpet, ripping the door open. It was Simon. He looked deeply disheveled, his waterproof jacket dripping with the freezing Chicago rain, holding a thick, overstuffed manila envelope tightly against his chest, as if it contained a live bomb. "You're not going to like this, man," Simon said, immediately, stepping into the dismal room and locking the deadbolt behind him. "I haven't slept in 48 hours. I dug deep into your digital footprint. I thought maybe she hired a high-end private investigator who tailed you, or maybe Chloe got arrogant and sloppy with her social media geotags. I was looking for a breach." "And?" Chris demanded, his voice hoarse, his throat tight with rising panic. "Where was the leak? Who tipped her off?" Simon walked over to the small, laminate desk in the corner and dropped the heavy envelope. It hit the wood with a sickening, definitive thud. "There was no tip-off, Chris," Simon said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "And Sarah didn't find out recently. She didn't find out last week or last month. She's known about Chloe for almost 11 months. Chris stopped breathing. The hum of the motel's ancient mini-fridge suddenly sounded like a jet engine in his ears. 11 months? Simon, that's impossible. That's insane. Chloe and I only started the affair a year ago." "I know," Simon said grimly. He unclasped the envelope, pulled out a staggering stack of printed network logs, server receipts, and digital screenshots, and spread them across the motel bed, like a coroner displaying autopsy photos. "Exactly 32 days after your first hotel booking with Chloe, Sarah initiated a counteroffensive," Simon explained, tapping a heavily highlighted IP address. "She waited until you were on a business trip, and she installed a military-grade, ghosted keystroke logger on your home office iMac. It's the kind of software corporate espionage firms use. It runs silently in the background, entirely undetectable by standard antivirus programs." But she didn't stop there. Chris felt a cold, slick sweat break out across his forehead and the back of his neck. "What else did she do?" "She mirrored your iCloud account," Simon said, pointing to a diagram he had hastily drawn on a legal pad. "Every single text message you sent to Chloe, every late-night photo, every deleted email confirming your reservations at the Four Seasons in Aspen, every single digital footprint you made was instantly routed in real time to a secure, offshore cloud server. And she set up that server under a dummy LLC registered in Delaware. She called the LLC Icarus Holdings. Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun." Chris felt the floor drop out from underneath him. "She watched me do it?" Chris whispered, his voice trembling, as the sheer, terrifying psychological weight of the revelation crushed him. "For almost a year? Simon?" I sat across from her at the dinner table. "I texted Chloe under the tablecloth while Sarah was pouring my wine. She smiled at me. She asked me how my day was. She watched every single keystroke, Chris. For 330 days, Simon confirmed softly. Why do you think she never confronted you? Why do you think she played the devoted, oblivious wife?" "I don't know," Chris shouted, pacing the narrow strip of carpet, his mind fracturing. "If she had all this proof, why didn't she just serve me papers 10 months ago?" "Because of the math, Chris. Because of the trust fund," Simon said, pulling a dense, legal financial document from the pile. It bore the crest of the Pendleton Family Trust. "Look at this timeline. You need to understand the financial trap she built." Simon laid out a chronological chart on the bed, tapping his pen against the dates. Month 1. She discovers the affair. She secures the digital proof. She remains entirely silent. Month 3. You sign the renegotiated executive contract at the advertising firm. The one with the incredibly strict, ironclad morality clause. Do you remember who pushed the board to include that specific clause in all VP contracts? Chris felt the blood drain entirely from his face. Her father, Arthur Pendleton. Exactly, Simon nodded. Arthur engineered the weapon, and Sarah held on to it, but she still waited. Why? Month 6. The Pendleton Family Trust reaches its 5-year maturation date. Millions of dollars in company shares vest directly into your joint marital account. If she had divorced you in month 2, before the shares vested, you would have walked away with a clean 50% of your own substantial savings and retirement. You would have been fine. Simon tapped the final date on the chart. By waiting until month 11, she ensured the trust money was legally commingled in your joint accounts. And because you used the corporate credit card to fund your affair with Chloe, which Arthur brilliantly classified as embezzlement and financial fraud against the company the Pendleton Trust's fiduciary clause was triggered, Sarah is legally entitled to claw back every single dime of that trust money, plus punitive damages from your half of the marital assets. She trapped you in your own greed. She let you dig the hole for 11 months, handed you the shovel, and waited for you to climb in. Chris stared at the paper, his breathing shallow, his chest tightening as if wrapped in iron bands. It was a masterpiece of vengeance. It was cold, calculating, and flawlessly executed. "There's one more thing," Simon said. He didn't look at Chris this time. He reached into the very bottom of the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of pale blue paper. It was a medical billing record from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The pregnancy. Chris backed away from the bed, his hands raised, as if to ward off a physical blow. "No, stop. We haven't been intimate in almost 6 months. I haven't touched her. The baby isn't mine. That's my way out. I can prove infidelity on her part. The baby is yours, Chris," Simon said gently, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of pity and awe. "Do you remember 3 years ago, when you guys were desperately trying to conceive? When you went to that high-end fertility clinic downtown, you produced samples. You froze embryos, just in case the natural route didn't work. The dingy walls of the motel room seemed to spin violently. No, no, she wouldn't do that. She legally couldn't do that without my signature." "She did," Simon corrected him, pointing to a scanned signature on the second page. "You signed a blanket, irrevocable authorization form 3 years ago, Chris. It allowed her to initiate a transfer at her sole discretion. You didn't read the fine print. 2.5 months ago, right after the Pendleton stock fully vested into your accounts, she initiated an IVF embryo transfer. She didn't get pregnant by accident. She mathematically calculated the conception." "Why?" Chris choked out, tears of absolute panic and devastation finally spilling over his eyelashes. "Why bring a child into this nightmare?" "Because of Illinois family law precedent," Simon explained grimly. "In this state, when a marriage dissolves due to documented, egregious financial infidelity and embezzlement, the judge has massive discretionary power. But when the victimized spouse is also actively pregnant with the couple's child, a judge will unilaterally award sole possession of the primary residence to the mother to ensure the child's stability. She used the pregnancy as the final lock on the Oak Creek estate. It guarantees her the house, and it guarantees you will pay the absolute maximum threshold for child support for the next 18 years. Chris's legs finally gave out. He collapsed backward onto the lumpy mattress, staring blindly up at the water-stained, popcorn ceiling of the cheap motel. Sarah hadn't just divorced him. She had executed a flawless, surgical, military-grade strike on his entire existence. She had secured the multi-million-dollar house, reclaimed the massive trust fund, orchestrated his humiliating termination from his career, and initiated the conception of the child she had always wanted, all while making him legally and financially responsible for every single ounce of it. He had spent the last year thinking he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he was the architect of a perfect, untouchable, dual life. But as the neon light flickered over the damning evidence spread across the bed, Christopher Reynolds finally realized the horrifying truth. He was never the architect. He was simply the raw material. And Sarah had used him to build her own empire. The fluorescent lights of the Cook County Family Court building buzzed with a low, oppressive hum that seemed to vibrate straight into Christopher's teeth. The air inside courtroom 4B smelled faintly of lemon floor wax, old paper, and the distinct, sour metallic tang of human desperation. Christopher sat rigidly at the scarred mahogany defense table, adjusting the collar of a charcoal suit that now hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He had lost 15 pounds since the night at Anton's steakhouse. His cheekbones were sharp, his eyes sunken and underscored by dark, bruised shadows. Beside him, his lawyer, David, tapped a gold pen rhythmically against a yellow legal pad, his face etched with the grim, sweating resignation of a man who knew he was walking his client to the financial gallows. Across the center aisle sat Sarah. It had been 4 months since the delivery of the divorce papers, and the transformation in her was staggering. She didn't look like a woman whose marriage had just violently imploded. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly untouchable. Her pregnancy was now clearly visible beneath a tailored, emerald green maternity dress that draped perfectly over her swelling stomach. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded serenely in her lap. Next to her was Eleanor Hayes, a senior partner at Sterling and Hayes, a woman whose reputation for completely dismantling unfaithful spouses was legendary in the Chicago legal circuit. Eleanor wore a sharp, crimson blazer, her silver hair cropped into a severe bob, her eyes scanning the room with the predatory calculation of a hawk. Sitting in the first row of the public gallery, hands resting heavily on a silver-tipped cane, was Arthur Pendleton. He wasn't required to be there. He was there to watch the final nail be driven into the coffin he had helped build. "All rise," the bailiff droned, his voice echoing off the high, wood-paneled walls as the heavy side door swung open. Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense magistrate with 30 years on the bench and a notoriously low tolerance for affluent hubris, took his seat. He adjusted his heavy black robes and peered over the rim of his reading glasses. "Be seated. We are here for the final dissolution settlement and evidentiary ruling in the matter of Reynolds v. Reynolds," Judge Harrison announced, his gravelly voice demanding absolute silence. "Counsel, I have spent the weekend reviewing the proposed division of assets, the spousal support requests, and the custody parameters submitted by the petitioner. I have also read the respondent's objections. Mr. Reynolds, your counsel has filed a rather aggressive motion objecting to the alimony calculations and the absolute forfeiture of the Oak Creek estate. Care to elaborate, counselor? Because looking at this docket, you have a steep hill to climb." David stood up, clearing his throat and attempting to project an authority he clearly did not feel. "Your Honor, while my client fully acknowledges the dissolution of the marriage, the proposed settlement submitted by Miss Hayes leaves him virtually destitute. The petitioner is requesting the primary residence, 70% of the liquid marital assets, and a staggering sum in monthly spousal and child support. Furthermore, my client's recent, sudden unemployment has severely impacted his current earning capacity. We ask the court for a standard 50-50 split of the liquid assets and an equitable buyout of the Oak Creek property. Mr. Reynolds has been stripped of his livelihood. He cannot be expected to bleed water from a stone." Eleanor Hayes didn't even bother to stand fully. She merely leaned her weight onto her elbows, pulling her microphone closer. "Your Honor, Mr. Reynolds's unemployment is not a tragedy of circumstance. It is a direct, calculated result of his own gross misconduct," Eleanor stated, her voice smooth, cold, and entirely lethal. "He willfully violated the morality clause of his executive contract with Pendleton and Hayes Advertising. But he didn't just cheat on his wife, he used his corporate position to embezzle funds, to facilitate a prolonged, year-long extramarital affair with a subordinate." "Objection," David barked, his face flushing. "My client was never criminally charged with embezzlement. Only because the firm chose to terminate him internally to avoid a public media circus," Eleanor shot back seamlessly, sliding a massive, 4-inch thick black binder across the polished table toward the judge's clerk. "Your Honor, I submit into evidence Exhibit B, 72 pages of documented expense reports, credit card statements, and geo-tracked text messages. These detail client dinners at Anton's Steakhouse, business summits in Chicago that were actually weekend retreats in Aspen, and thousands of dollars in luxury gifts, all billed to the company card or the joint marital account. This constitutes an egregious dissipation of marital assets. Christopher felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin icy and clammy. He stared at the thick binder. It was his entire double life, printed, indexed, and weaponized. Eleanor paused, letting the sheer volume of the evidence settle over the silent courtroom before she delivered her next devastating blow. Furthermore, the respondent is attempting to claim a portion of the Pendleton Family Trust disbursements. As outlined in Exhibit C, those funds were transferred into the joint account conditionally because Mr. Reynolds committed financial fraud against the Pendleton firm, which is the entity funding that trusts those funds are subject to a legal clawback by my client. He does not get to keep the money he stole from his wife's family to fund his mistress. Judge Harrison flipped heavily through the binder, his eyes scanning the highlighted receipts and printed text messages. His jaw tightened. He looked at Christopher, his expression devoid of even a microscopic trace of sympathy. David, sensing the tide turning into a tsunami, desperately tried to pivot. Your Honor, if we may address the timeline and the custody parameters, my client asserts that Sarah Reynolds acted in profound bad faith. She knew about the alleged affair for nearly 11 months before filing. She waited specifically for my client's company stock to vest. More disturbingly, she utilized a fertility clinic to undergo IVF implantation, using my client's frozen biological material without his immediate knowledge or explicit consent, solely to leverage a pregnancy in this court for maximum asset seizure and sole possession of the home. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. David had thrown his final, desperate grenade. Christopher looked pleadingly at the judge. See her, he thought. See the monster she actually is. Eleanor Hayes smiled. It was a thin, predatory line that sent a shiver down Christopher's spine. Your Honor, the audacity of the respondent is truly boundless, Eleanor purred. Opening a slender, red folder, my client and her husband had frozen embryos resulting from their joint, deeply emotional fertility treatments 2 years ago. The clinic records, which are attached as Exhibit F, show that Mr. Reynolds signed a blanket authorization form notarized by his own assistant, allowing his wife to initiate implantation at her sole discretion at any time in the future. He did not read the fine print of his own medical documents. As for her timeline regarding his infidelity, there is absolutely no legal statute in the state of Illinois dictating when a traumatized spouse must file for divorce after discovering their partner's systemic betrayal. Eleanor turned slightly, locking eyes with Christopher for the first time. Sarah Reynolds stayed in the marital home, trying to process the psychological devastation of her husband's actions. She initiated the pregnancy because it was her last viable biological window, and she had the legal and contractual right to do so. She is a victim who managed to survive her husband's cruelty, not a mastermind. Judge Harrison held up a hand, silencing the room. He closed the thick black binder with a loud, definitive thud. He removed his reading glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose, before leaning forward to look directly at Christopher. Mr. Reynolds, the judge began, his voice echoing with terrible finality. In my 3 decades on this bench, I have seen marriages end for 1,000 different reasons, but the level of arrogance, deceit, and financial manipulation you have displayed is uniquely abhorrent. You used marital funds and corporate funds to finance a lavish double life. You treated your marriage as a convenience and your wife as a fool. On the other hand, Mrs. Reynolds maintained the household, endured your betrayals, and is now expecting your child. Christopher's throat constricted so tightly he couldn't swallow. The heavy oak walls of the courtroom felt like they were shrinking, closing in on him. The law does not reward deceit, Judge Harrison continued, his tone hardening into steel, nor does it exist to cushion the fall for a man who jumps off a cliff of his own volition. The court finds the petitioner's requests to be highly structured, Yes, but entirely, perfectly within the bounds of Illinois state law. The judge picked up his pen, signing the bottom of the settlement decree with heavy, angry strokes. The Oak Creek estate is awarded fully and exclusively to Sarah Reynolds. The joint liquid assets will be divided 70-30 in favor of the petitioner to offset the dissipated marital funds used during the respondent's affair. The Pendleton Trust funds are formally clawed back to the petitioner. Full physical and legal custody of the unborn child is awarded to the mother. Given your current lack of stable housing and income, the father is granted only supervised visitation every other weekend, contingent upon maintaining a suitable, court-approved residence. The judge set the pen down. Furthermore, you will pay $4,500 a month in combined child and spousal support, Mr. Reynolds. I do not care that you are currently underemployed. Your earning capacity as a former vice president dictates this number. I highly suggest you find lucrative employment immediately, or you will find yourself back in my courtroom facing contempt and jail time. The wooden gavel cracked against the sounding block like a gunshot. Case closed. Court is adjourned, the bailiff announced. Christopher sat completely frozen, his breathing shallow and rapid. Across the aisle, Sarah calmly stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her emerald dress, picked up her designer handbag, and shook Eleanor's hand with a warm, genuine smile. She didn't glance his way. She didn't gloat. She didn't sneer. She didn't offer a single look of triumph. To her, he was simply a transaction that had been successfully closed. Arthur Pendleton pushed himself up from the gallery bench, his cane clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He walked over to his daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder, and together they walked out through the heavy double doors, stepping out into the rest of their lives. Christopher was left sitting alone at the defendant's table in the empty courtroom. He was bankrupt, humiliated, heavily indebted, and utterly erased from the empire he thought he ruled. The absolute silence of the room pressed down on him, deafening and complete. 7 months later, the icy, brutal Chicago winter had finally thawed, giving way to a crisp, unforgiving spring. The city was waking up, shedding its gray slush for budding trees and pale sunlight, but for Christopher Reynolds, the world remained entirely frozen. He walked through the sliding glass double doors of St. Jude's Medical Center, his worn leather shoes squeaking faintly on the pristine, buffed linoleum. He was carrying a small, plush pink elephant. The cardboard tags were still attached to its ear. It had cost him $42.50 at a chain pharmacy down the street, a sum he actually had to meticulously budget for these days. To afford it, he had skipped lunch for the past 4 days, subsisting on the burnt, bitter coffee provided in the break room of his new employer. Christopher was currently working as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a grim, mid-sized freight shipping company out in the industrial sprawl of Cicero. His days, which used to be filled with high-stakes client lunches, expensive scotch, and million-dollar advertising pitches, were now reduced to tracking delayed pallets of industrial fertilizer and arguing with exhausted truck drivers over CB radios. He made a mere fraction of his former executive vice president salary. The moment his bi-weekly paycheck hit his heavily monitored, bare-bones checking account, over half of it vanished instantly. It was automatically garnished and routed into the court-mandated accounts for Sarah's spousal and child support. The remaining funds barely covered the rent for his cramped, beige, one-bedroom apartment situated above a noisy 2-4-hour laundromat and the gas required for his grueling 90-minute commute in a 10-year-old, rattling Honda Civic he had bought off a used lot. Chloe had left him the very morning after the trial. Without the prestigious title, the endless corporate expense account, and the shining promise of a luxury downtown condo, his magnetic appeal had evaporated overnight. She hadn't even offered a tearful goodbye or a dramatic fight. She had simply packed her designer bags, called an Uber Black, and stood by the door of his motel room. "You're a sinking ship, Chris," she had said, her voice completely devoid of the sultry affection he had thrown his life away for. And I don't drown. Good luck. She had blocked his number before her flight to New York even took off, transferring to a rival agency without looking back. He rode the glass-paneled elevator up to the fourth-floor VIP maternity ward, his stomach twisting into painful, jagged knots. The air up here was different. It didn't smell like sharp antiseptic and sickness. It smelled like fresh linens, expensive vanilla lotion, and quiet privilege. The nurse's station, manned by smiling staff in tailored scrubs, pointed him quietly down the hushed, carpeted hallway toward room 412. The heavy, soundproof wooden door was slightly ajar. Chris stopped in the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pressed his back against the wall, holding his breath as he looked through the narrow 2-inch gap. The private, sprawling hospital suite was flooded with golden morning sunlight. The room was choked with towering, extravagant floral arrangements, bouquets of rare white orchids, imported lilies, and massive displays of pink roses. And in the center of the room, sitting up in a motorized hospital bed, was Sarah. She looked ethereal. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose, elegant braid that cascaded over her shoulder. She was wearing a soft, silk robe instead of a coarse hospital gown. She was looking down at a small bundle wrapped in a striped pastel hospital blanket, her face illuminated by a profound, gentle, and fierce love that Chris hadn't seen directed at him in years. Arthur Pendleton was sitting in a plush leather armchair in the corner of the room, his silver-tipped cane resting against his knee as he quietly read the Wall Street Journal. It was a perfect, cinematic picture of a complete, insulated, wealthy family. It was an impenetrable fortress, and Christopher was entirely locked out. He swallowed hard, forcing down the lump of pure ash in his throat, and knocked softly on the wooden doorframe. Arthur looked up first. The older man's jaw instantly tightened, his eyes narrowing into cold, protective slits. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a warning. Sarah slowly lifted her gaze. Her eyes, which used to crinkle with warmth whenever he walked into a room, were perfectly calm, unreadable, utterly void of any lingering trauma or affection. "You came," she said quietly, her voice smooth and even. "I did," Chris rasped, stepping tentatively into the room. He felt like a trespasser in a museum, terrified of breathing too heavily. He walked awkwardly toward the edge of the bed, holding out the cheap plush elephant like a white flag. I brought this. For her." "Put it on the table, Christopher," Sarah said, not reaching out to take it. He set the neon pink, polyester toy down next to a towering $500 arrangement of white orchids sent by the Pendleton and Hayes Board of Directors. The stark contrast between his pathetic offering and the immense wealth surrounding his ex-wife was a physical blow. He moved slowly to the side of the bed, his breath catching painfully in his throat as he finally looked down at the baby. She had a thick wisp of dark hair, just like Sarah's, and perfect, tiny, delicate features. Her little fists were curled tightly under her chin, and she was breathing in soft, rapid, rhythmic puffs. She was sleeping soundly, completely oblivious to the brutal, calculated war that had been waged in a courtroom to secure her future. "Her name is Claire," Sarah offered, adjusting the soft blanket around the baby's chin with a reverent touch. "Claire?" Chris repeated. The name tasted like honey and broken glass on his tongue. "She's beautiful, Sarah. She looks exactly like you." "She does," Sarah agreed, a faint, proud smile touching her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes when she looked back at him. "Can I?" Chris hesitated, his hands trembling visibly at his sides. He felt entirely unworthy of touching her, stained by his own deceit and failure. "Can I hold her?" Sarah looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. Chris braced himself for the rejection. He expected her to sneer, to pull the baby closer to her chest, to remind him of the ruin he had brought upon their marriage. But there was no hatred in her eyes, no vindictive fire, no petty cruelty. There was only a cold, polished, absolute indifference. It was the look of a woman who had meticulously excised a malignant tumor from her life, and was now entirely, completely healed. He didn't matter enough to hate anymore. Just for a minute, Sarah said, her tone purely transactional. She just fell asleep, and I don't want her schedule disrupted. Chris reached down, his hands clumsy and shaking as he took the small, fragile weight of his daughter. He supported her neck, just as he had read in the parenting books he had bought years ago when they first started trying to conceive. He pulled Claire against his chest. A profound, crushing wave of grief, heavier than anything he had ever experienced in his life, crashed over him. He smelled the sweet scent of baby powder and warm milk. He felt the faint, rapid beating of her tiny heart against his own. This was his child. This was his flesh and blood. This was the family he had always claimed he wanted, the life he had built from the ground up, the legacy he had imagined. But as he stood there holding his daughter, looking around the sterile, luxurious hospital room, at the father-in-law who had ruthlessly fired him, at the ex-wife who had brilliantly bankrupted him, and at the daughter who would grow up in a sprawling, beautiful house, he was legally barred from entering the absolute, horrifying reality of his choices settled over him like a suffocating blanket of lead. He had thought he was so incredibly clever, laughing in the dim, expensive shadows of Anton's steakhouse. He thought he was the puppet master, stringing along a complacent wife and a beautiful mistress. But the joke had been on him the entire time. He had built his own cage, locked the door from the inside, and handed Sarah the key. "Your minute is up, Christopher." Arthur's deep, gravelly voice cut through the silence from the corner of the room. The older man snapped his pocket watch shut with a loud click. Chris closed his eyes for a split second, memorizing the weight of his daughter in his arms. He gently, reluctantly leaned over and handed Claire back to Sarah. He lingered for a second by the bed, desperately wanting to say something profound. He wanted to apologize, to scream, to fall to his knees and beg for a time machine to take him back a year. But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped behind a wall of permanent consequence. There was nothing left to negotiate, no deal left to broker, no account left to win. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Goodbye, Chris," she replied, not looking up at him. Her attention was already entirely, fiercely focused back on her daughter. Christopher Reynolds turned and walked out of the hospital room, stepping out into the bright, sterile hallway. He walked slowly back to the elevator, a hollowed-out shell of a man, stepping back into a cold, lonely life where he was no longer the main character, but merely a fading ghost, haunting the distant edges of someone else's happily ever after. If this story of betrayal, calculated revenge, and the brutal consequences of a double life gripped you, you are not alone. Christopher thought he held all the cards, but Sarah proved that the quietest players often have the most devastating strategies. What did you think of Sarah's master plan? Was her meticulously timed retaliation completely justified, or did she cross the line by using his job and the IVF treatment against him? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you want more intense, real-life drama stories with twists you never see coming, make sure to completely smash that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good revenge plot, and hit subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss an upload.